else to get united. Like, what we gotta do is meet everybody on 149th Street at the bench.
Reading graffiti when you're brand new to the art form can seem practically impossible, especially the more advanced the graffiti becomes, the harder it becomes to read. But what if I told you your inability to read the more technical forms of graffiti may not be entirely your fault? A lot of times, it might actually be the fault of the graffiti artists who made the graffiti in the first place. So in today's video, I want to demystify this entire topic and teach you guys how to read graffiti. Now, we are going to be focusing on pieces, but understand everything I teach you in today's video is going to apply to hand styles and throwies just as much. So let's start right from the beginning. Let's assume that you're spanking new into graffiti and you don't know anything, right? So you have three different major forms of graffiti, which are these bad boys right here. Now, pieces, this category right here, has three categories underneath itself, which looks a little bit like this. So the first one is straight letter, and it's our simplest form of piecing, period. These letter structures remain within their basic print font, with little style added to them. Yes, you can add style, and you can have incredible work within this category, but this category does not exceed a certain threshold of style and kind of like technicality, if you will. And this right here is a great example of a straight letter. You can see nothing's crazy going on here. The letters are very legible, pretty much intact, nothing's distorted at all whatsoever, and that's a key part of straight letters. The letter structure does not get distorted, nor does it get obscured either. But the same can't be said for the next category, and that's pieces. Now, don't get confused here. I know it's the same exact name as the actual category itself, but consider this one the category and this one the subcategory. Now, with pieces, you're able to add more style than the straight letters are able to have. You're able to also distort the letter structures and even obscure them to a, reasonable amount. But even pieces remain within a certain threshold of style. You can't distort them too much, otherwise you're gonna start bridging into the next section over here. And one of you guys submitted this beautiful bark piece right here. That's a great example of a basic piece. You could see it's not necessarily a straight letter, there's still some distortion happening around and a lot of stylization, but the letters are still pretty easily readable, with the B being here, the A being there, the R being here, and the K being there. Another good example of basic pieces is something that our good friend Josh went ahead and submitted. Look at this. We can tell this isn't necessarily a straight letter, there's a little bit too much style added to it, but it's not quite a wild style either. It's still pretty simplistic overall, and it's a nice, beautiful piece. The letters are still pretty legible. You have a nice, beautiful J here, which kicks on over. You have a good O right there, a beautiful S, which kicks back that way, and then a nice, large H. Now, when you're reading both pieces and straight letters, you want to go ahead and take note of a nice, definitive structure, because this nice, definitive structure remains consistent in wild styles, at least well-done wild styles. A well-done wild style is not going to sacrifice good letter structure. And that brings us to the very last category right over here, wild styles. Now, wild styles have absolutely no limitations to how much style can be added to them. Sky's the limit with wild styles. But this does not mean you can forego the fundamentals of graffiti. You still have to follow the fundamentals of graffiti. And a well-done wild style will maintain the letter structure of the letter. And that's true no matter how much style you go ahead and add it to it. In fact, we can actually see this in Saber's graffiti, somebody who's infamous for having some of the craziest wild styles out there. And his work is truly amazing, so if he can keep the letter structure in something like this, then you can too. So give it a go, see if you can go ahead and read this. Pause the video if you need to, but I'm gonna go ahead and point out the letters now. So even in something like this, with all of the detail he's gone ahead and added to this piece, he still has the letter structures nicely developed. Each and every single one is fundamentally correct, even though all of those details seem to obscure the letter structure. And here's something you gotta understand, whether you're reading a wild style or whether you're doing a wild style, the letter structure comes first. So if you can understand and identify the letter structure in your basic straight letters and pieces, then you want to keep that in mind when observing a wild style and trying to read that. And having that ability in order to understand and perceive the basic letter structure will allow you to strip away all of the excess fat in the more stylistic pieces of graffiti. Now, here's the downside about wild styles that a lot of people who are trying to read graffiti end up falling into, and they don't realize it's not their fault. Wild style gives intermediate and even experienced graffiti artists the opportunity to hide their mistakes. A lot of times you'll see very experienced graffiti artists have severely critical fundamental flaws within their work, but they hide the mistake using extensions and exterior details and so on and so forth. Now, in the worst case scenario, the graffiti artist has sacrificed the fundamentals for the sake of style, which ended up resulting in destroying the majority of the letters or all of the letters. And we can actually see that in some of these pieces here, like this BLCK piece. Sure, we can see the L very clearly right there. We also have the C, which we'll get into what the issue is there, and then we can very clearly see this nice beautiful K. Both the L and the K are the best letters within this piece, nicely developed. But the B has so many distortions to where this is no longer the letter B. So if you couldn't read this, this wouldn't really be your fault. The first letter sacrificed a lot of its fundamentals for the sake of style. Now the C does this to a much lesser extent. The letter C definitively is there. The only issue here is the letter T is also definitively there. And this is one of the struggles with wild styles that a lot of amateur artists don't really consider. They don't consider how the unnecessary parts of the letter structure can affect the necessary parts of the letter structure. Another issue badly executed wild styles have is they tend to obscure simple letters too much. And this is actually something that we see in Kofa's piece. Here we have what's supposed to be a C right there, an O, followed by an F, followed by an A. The issue is, even though these letters are pretty simplistic, they get obscured, and that can end up chopping off huge portions of letter structures and sometimes even make the letter into a totally different letter. For example, this extension comes down and completely amputates the A's right leg from here downward, which means nobody can be blamed if they see this as being an O, because technically this top piece does not connect to either of these lower pieces. So segmenting your letters by obscuring them with extensions is another massive issue you'll run into when trying to read people's wild styles. Now we have this piece right here from Jest. And the issue with this one is, once again, we're seeing another graffiti artist sacrifice many of graffiti's fundamentals for the sake of style. And this completely destroys certain letter structures and makes other letter structures more ambiguous. The J, for example, almost doesn't even exist at this point, just because of the simple fact that he segmented the top portion from the lower portion, and then also hardly has any of the top right of the letter J as well. Taking the lowercase e and making it into something like this also doesn't really flow with any of the other letters at all whatsoever, so you wouldn't be forgiven for not expecting this to be a lowercase e. Add on top of that the really sloppy structure of the S and the T as well, and what you have is a lost name. Now those were all examples of poorly executed wild styles that you really wouldn't be able to read, or at least you wouldn't be at fault if you couldn't read them. So let's kind of flip that on its head and look at some really well executed graffiti where the artist went ahead and stylized quite a bit and the letters are definitively there. You'll immediately see the difference. Check out this calc piece. Now this one isn't the craziest, right? It's not the most stylized, but I think it's a good starting point for us, because right here you'll see a nicely developed K, a nicely developed A nice beautiful L, and then a gorgeous K. Those letters are easy to read, and if we go ahead and take this piece, we can practice chopping away the excess fat of the actual piece itself. So we know where each letter is. That means we can kind of understand, alright, none of this is letter structure. What differentiates the two? Well, we can see, like I said before, that change in width for the letters. We see how this thins out, these little details also thin out, and sure, it gets thicker, but by this point we've already seen the letter structure, so we know this isn't letter structure. We also have to consider how the other fundamentals come in play here. We see that each letter is a certain size, and that goes for both height and width. We also know that they're within a certain position of one another, right? The baseline is established. This tells us there's no way something like this could be letter structure, because not only is it not the right height or width, but it's not in the right position either. You want to consider all of graffiti's fundamentals when trying to read wild styles. Consider what you can. In some cases, like this piece right here, which I'm not going to point out the letters just yet, try and see if you can spot a singular letter doing what we've already learned so far. Try to identify a definitive letter structure and chop away the fat. Then keep those fundamentals uniform in your head and apply them to other areas. So for example, we can see a definitive E right here. Yeah, that's a very stylized lowercase e, but it's definitely there. Well, this tells us the standard height and width of the actual letter itself. It also tells us the average width of the basic box, which means that little details like this and this are not going to classify as letters. So we can do one of two things at this point. We can either look for basic boxes this thick, or we can look for things that resemble more so this. And what we'd end up finding is we see, alright, well, we're getting that more uniform letter structure thickness here. What is that? That looks like an S, right? Alright, so now we have our two letters. For the third letter, we can go ahead and start chopping away at little details like that, and we see, alright, well, this doesn't quite make sense there. That's a little bit kind of out of place. Same thing with these little secondary details that are kind of thwipping all over the place. So we can just get rid of all that. And once we're able to go ahead and do that, we can spot the more uniform thickness for the letter structure itself. We look for the same width and the height, and what do we find? We have a slightly incorrect, very distorted B. And why do I say that? Well, because he's starting to lose the letter structure at this point. It still is there. This by no means is like terrible, right? It's not toy by any stretch of the imagination, but it's certainly not in line with what he's already shown us, with the nicely defined letter structures. And the same thing for the fourth letter, which actually definitively is not there. If we look at the basic width and height, this is supposed to say Esber, E-S-B-E-R, and there's nothing really there within this zone that resembles an E. You could make the case for this right here, but it's a bit of a weaker letter. So in a situation like this, you have have each letter developed, but some letters are weaker than others, and then some letters are just definitively not really there. And this is kind of the game you play with wild styles. So let's do this one last time on this final piece right here. See if you can apply what we've learned so far. Take out the extensions, take out all that secondary stuff. Even the 3D if you need to, if it's too distracting. Mentally, kind of get rid of all that and narrow it down to just the necessary parts of the letter. The same way you would see in your basic straight letters and pieces. And what you'd find is you have an L, another L, followed by an S. But there's a bit of an issue. There's a bit of a vowel missing here. We don't have all the letters represented. Well, this is where, admittedly, knowing what the graffiti artist writes would help out a little bit because you have a sneaky little O right up there. And admittedly, they did not define this O enough from the other letter structures. If you want to go ahead and make a letter very fundamentally different than all the other letters, then you need to go ahead and contrast it in some way in order to make it pop out so people know it exists. Otherwise, you run into fundamental flaws. And that contrast is going to compensate for whatever fundamental it is you decided to distort. In this case, it's letter positioning and letter name weight. So in order to compensate for the letter positioning and letter name weight, he would go ahead and make it contrast quite a bit. That way you can add more letter name weight to justify the letter name positioning. Also, the S doesn't really get too thick down here, but that's a different story. And he's also got inconsistent 3D, but once again, that's a different story. Not a bad piece overall. But dudes, that's pretty much how you read wild styles. Do know that once again, the responsibility does not entirely fall onto you, the reader. A lot of the responsibility, in fact, the majority of the responsibility falls onto the graffiti artist in the first place. And understand, a lot of graffiti artists use wild styles in order to cover up many mistakes. But if you use tips in this video, you should be able to read most graffiti without any issue at all. Now, if you don't want to make the same mistakes that some of these people made in the video, be sure to go ahead and pick up one of the books I published in the description down below. And we also have the best how to do graffiti tutorials right up here. It's got pretty much everything you would want to know about graffiti, with more graffiti content right down here. But on that note, I'll catch you guys back here next week. Thanks for watching.